Welcome to this Energy Chat conversation. I'm Jesse Jenkins with theenergycollective.com, and today we're talking about EPA's historic regulations for carbon pollution from power plants released on Monday. It's generated quite the discussion. The first nationwide effort to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from power plants across the country. The EPA would establish targets that each state would have to meet in terms of reducing the overall carbon intensity of the electricity mix in each state, and in an effort to target reductions of 30% in carbon emissions nationwide by 2030. I'm joined today to dissect this proposal by three of our columnists at the Energy Collective, each energy experts in their own domain. I'm joined by Jim Pierobon, Geoff Stiles, Matt Stepp, and John Miller, although it looks like perhaps we have lost Jim at the moment. So why don't we start, Geoff, why don't we start with you? Talk us through what does this mean for the energy mix in each state in the country? We're talking about a 30% aggregate cut in CO2 emissions by 2030, but each state has to adopt a different kind of objective. What are we looking at in terms of the kind of energy mix for the future?
Yeah, you've actually hit the key point here is that this isn't one plan for clean energy. This is ultimately 50 plans. It's 50 guidelines from the EPA, and then states have to develop their own plan. Initially, as this was rolled out, it sort of briefly looked like this was kind of EPA's Willie Sutton moment for going after coal. But when you look at the details of it, it's not clear that that's the case at all, although I think it could still prove very challenging for coal. Just to kind of give you some context, in order to meet the 30% reduction, if you were dealing with the generating the fuel mix that we had last year, not the generating the fuel mix, you could meet that today if every single coal plant in America were replaced by a state-of-the-art coal plant. I'm talking about ultra supercritical pulverized coal combustion or integrated gasification combined cycle. Now, that can't happen. That's not going to be how this plays out, because it turns out that due to another rule that the EPA released last fall, today's state-of-the-art coal plant does not actually meet EPA guidelines for acceptable new sources. You'd have to add carbon capture and sequestration, which I think most utilities would say is beyond state-of-the-art at this point. There's two power plants being built in North America with integrated with carbon capture and sequestration. We'll see how those work out. They're going to be expensive to build and expensive to operate.
So new power plants have to comply with a previous rule that sets an emissions performance standard for each individual power plant. I think it's about 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour. Which is sort of about where a combined cycle gas plant is, correct? But the standards for existing power plants released this week by EPA don't apply at the individual power plant level, right? They apply to a statewide target across the entire power mix.
That's exactly right, and I think based on a session that I watched this morning from Resources from the Future, there's some questions about whether that can actually be done that way or not, whether you can apply the Clean Air Act that way. But superficially, really what you're talking about in the near term is a big shift towards gas. The EPA looks at the existing natural gas combined cycle plants, which last year they say, in 2012, they say we're running at 46% average utilization. Stepping those up to 75% utilization would essentially get you to the 30% reduction. You would get about 600 million kilowatt hours additional generation from gas every year. And that would be enough to back out enough coal-fired generation to get you to the 30% reduction. However, EPA gives you 4 different ways to meet this. They look at improving the efficiency of existing power plants, dispatching different fuels, predominantly natural gas. They look at adding renewables, and they look at adding end-use efficiency. So there's multiple different ways that you can achieve these results. The big questions, I think, ultimately, going back to the first question that you asked, are going to be about how this plays out at the state level. Just, let me throw out some quick numbers and then hand it off to the next speaker. The thing that really surprised me as I was going through the EPA's technical document, looking at how this plays out on a state level, was that it doesn't work the way you would expect. So here you've got very coal-intensive states today, like West Virginia and Kentucky, that it looks like they're being asked to reduce their emissions by something like 18, 19%. That's actually comparable to what California would be asked to reduce its emissions by, even though California today is already well below the average emissions rate. And this is all about rate. This is how many pounds of CO2 does your power plant or your state emit for each kilowatt hour of electricity that's generated. And the extreme case of this is Washington State. Washington State has one of the most efficient generating mixes in the country in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and yet they're going to be asked to reduce their emissions by something like 70%.
Right.
So how this works out on the state level, I think, remains to be seen.
So in many ways, it looks like maybe our dash for gas here in the United States is that's the easiest way, perhaps, to meet the emissions reduction goals, increasing, as you said, the utilization rates at our existing natural gas plants. But John Miller, what does this look like for the future of coal? I mean, the EPA projects that this certainly isn't the end for coal entirely in the United States. I think they say that in 2030 they project that coal will still remain a substantial share of the U.S. energy mix. But what does this look like for the future of coal, which has already been embattled by cheap natural gas and now faces the challenge of carbon regulations as well?
Well, obviously on a state level, the reason why Washington has basically been stipulated to reduce its coal so much is effectively it's going to have to shut down its single coal power plant.
And it already plans to do that, correct? Which is partly why.
That's correct. So as far as Washington State goes, not such a burden. But the other states that have more than one coal plant, which obviously is through kind of the Midwest and the coal countries, their impacts are going to be greater. What I did is in the past I've done an analysis of what kind of power mixes it takes to achieve different levels of reduction, and I did a quick rough update. And just so you know, what I used for the basis is the DOE EIA, their annual energy outlook for 2014. And of course, the one thing that sticks out on that one, which differs from what the EPA is basically assuming, is that excuse me, the power consumption, which the EPA basically is assuming will go down substantially, actually is going to increase. And so I just kind of kept things constant with the EIA's regulation, and I went to achieve the 30% reduction, plus I upped the renewable power, wind and solar, a little bit more. And it looks like on the order of half of all the coal plants are going to have to shut down. Now, the one thing that I've done is that I have assumed that, over the next 15 years, we won't have, that assumes we don't make the breakthroughs in the carbon capture and sequester and efficiency, which is what a lot of the EPA and other organizations are assuming. But still, on the order, we're looking at up to half of all the coal plants are going to shut down. Now, to replace that power, like I said, it's going to involve renewables, which will be largely solar and wind. The one thing that doesn't seem to be working in the network right now, particularly with the time frame, would be improvements in other things like nuclear or hydro. Okay, so to balance out the system, what that effectively means is that the current generation capacity of natural gas could almost double, which that's on the surface, it's a good thing because we'll achieve the carbon emissions, the system reliability will still be there, the capacity will still be there. Of course, that still begs two real questions. One, obviously, is going to be the cost, because not only will we utilize the existing spare capacity, but that will require installing new capacity at quite a cost. And the other thing, which is kind of a side issue on the energy mix, is that when you double the natural gas power generation capacity, you also double the natural gas consumption. Now, this country is in good shape, as far as that fossil fuel has been increasing, and it's a relatively low carbon fossil fuel. But when I look at the projections for the future production in the U.S., it looks like doubling the natural gas power generation capacity could exceed the projected domestic production in the U.S., and we would be forced to import upwards of 1 trillion cubic feet.
What portion of U.S. natural gas consumption comes from the electric power sector today?
The electric power sector today, they consume roughly a third. Okay, a little bit more than that. And so the rest of it is consumed by the other sectors, and largely used for heat, as I'm sure you're aware. Okay, so effectively what we'd be doing is we'd be going from the 30% range of the power sector required natural gas up to almost 45% of all the natural gas would be consumed by the power sector, which it's your lowest carbon fossil fuel source. And then of course the costs would go up proportionally, and the total costs from a capital standpoint are considerably higher than what the EPA estimates appear to be. If I compare it to like the Chamber of Commerce, they're looking at something on the order of $500 million, and my own personal estimates indicate it could be as high as $1 trillion.
So why do we need substantial new power plant construction when we could increase the utilization rate of natural gas plants that are already in the fleet? They tend to have a much lower utilization rate today than our coal-fired power plants. And so I think EPA is looking at, when they calculate the state targets, are assuming that we're going to increase the rate of utilization at existing power plants rather than construct new ones over that time frame predominantly.
Well, there's two factors going on here, Jesse. One is that the EPA is basically assuming, rather than the power consumption between now and 2030 increasing by 13% as the EIA has projected, they're basically assuming that it decreases by 8%. That's over a 20% swing in power usage, which will be a challenge. Not impossible, will be a challenge, and also it's not free. Okay. Another thing is that the EPA looks like they're relying on some of the other past analyses, and what they do is that they are utilizing what we call excess capacity, but they're also utilizing what's also called reserves. And as other renewables, the intermediates like solar and wind increase, your need for reserves increases also. And unless there's that power storage out there, which we keep hoping will be developed because it will be required, you're going to have that spinning reserve out there, which today is largely natural gas.
Thanks. So Zach Coleman at the Washington Examiner has a nice overview of how EPA calculated the different emissions intensity targets for each state. He says that EPA first assumes that all coal-fired power plants could achieve a 6% improvement in efficiency. So within the fence at the power plants, they can get more efficient by upgrading their plants. And then next, projects states would ideally ramp up to a 70% utilization rate of natural gas generators, which is what we've just been talking about, getting a lot more annual output out of our existing natural gas fleet. Then they project that renewable energy potential will grow based on regional historical trends. So they're looking at the growth of renewables in each state, I think, as well as the state renewable portfolio standards that set out targets in more than half of those states. And then finally, they assume a 1 to 1.5% increase, annual increase in energy efficiency improvements over the decade from 2020 to 2030. And that's the issue you raised just there, John, that rather than seeing energy use grow, I think at about 0.9% a year, as the Energy Information Administration projects, they see an actual decline over time. And then, of course, states with nuclear power plants are given a credit, apparently, of 6% of their power mix as an incentive to prevent early retirements of those plants and boost the economic forecast for some of those nuclear plants facing retirement. Jim, well, we just lost Jim again. I was going to go to him. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the different options. So that's the plan that is sort of the rough calculation that EPA has made to calculate what they think is feasible for each state. But of course, each state has to come up with their own plan. So they may say, we don't want to rely that heavily on natural gas, or we don't think we can achieve energy efficiency improvements at that rate. So what are some of the other options that we might have to comply here? We mentioned carbon capture and storage. Jeff, do you think this increases the prospects that industry is going to invest more heavily in developing carbon capture for either existing plants or for natural gas or new construction?
You know, I think what it ultimately comes down to is how this translates into economic incentive. Because what we're really talking about at this point is a set of regulations on the rate of emissions per unit of power generated. I mean, and I think that's a crucial distinction between the sort of legislative approaches that we saw in the previous decade, which were really focused on capping total economy-wide emissions and then allowing all sources to play against each other under that cap. It's important to understand that what EPA is doing here, there is no cap. And if if electricity demand actually grew in accordance with what the EIA thinks is going to happen, rather than what the EPA thinks is going to happen, it could actually negate the savings that EPA is projecting from the implementation of these standards for the rate of emissions. So that's an important caveat here. How you can actually meet this at the state level, ultimately, you know, are states going to have to implement their own version of cap and trade? Will they join regional exchanges like RGGI? Will they effectively end up imposing a carbon tax within the state in order to create the incentives for whether it's carbon capture, sequestration, new nuclear? You know, a lot of these things are feasible technically, but they haven't been economical.
Right.
Partly because natural gas is very cheap, but the other thing that's happened is that, you know, we have a lot of new renewables coming in, which have a completely different cost structure. First of all, they have substantial subsidies, you know, behind the installation. Once it's in place, the marginal cost of generating power is very, very low. So in markets where they have a lot of renewables, like Texas, we see phenomena where at different times of the day, at different times of the year, the bid price for power is actually negative because the wind plant is able to deliver power at a negative cost because it's capturing a tax credit that pays for its operating costs. This has made life very, very difficult for baseload type generating facilities, you know, of any technology. And we're seeing this also play out in the German market, which has an even bigger penetration of renewables. So, you know, how you incentivize technologies to come into the market, how you incentivize technologies like nuclear that you want to keep because they have a very good emissions profile, you know, that's what the states are going to have to figure out as they figure out how to implement what EPA is asking them to do. And for good or ill, all of this is going to be happening against the huge uncertainty of all of the lawsuits that are going to be filed, pro and con, with regard to what EPA is proposing. Because the entire session this morning at Resources for the Future, most of it was devoted to the different legal issues that this entails, and some of them look to be fairly significant.
Yeah, let's come back to that legal issue in a bit. I want to make sure we cover that. Matt, Stepp, I want to bring you in the conversation. So, you know, as Jeff is mentioning, this is ultimately up to the states, and I think perhaps the most substantial impact this regulation will have is it's now put carbon emissions and greenhouse gas control on the docket for all 50 states of the country, something that has not been the case to date. What are some of the responses that states might have to, as Jeff mentioned, try to incentivize new technologies that can help their states comply with these standards? I mean, the easy route is ramping up natural gas fired power plants, but do we really want to put all our eggs in that basket? I can imagine lots of states looking for a more diverse approach to this and supporting other less mature technologies down the pipe. So how do you see this changing the game at the state policy level?
And thanks, Jesse. I think this is actually the key point, and somebody said it earlier. We may actually get 50 different state carbon reduction plans, each one reflecting different energy mixes, cost concerns, and political economies. So we may very well get 50 different experiments on how we can reduce these carbon emissions. So that's, I think, the really most important point. And the differences between the states are going to be immense, I think. You have states that typically use kind of the spaghetti on the wall approach to carbon reductions, places like California or New York or Massachusetts that have a really long history already of doing different subsidies, R&D, kind of innovation type work, different regulations that are going to try to continue those policies, ramp those policies up. Many states are going to rely more on, I think, the renewable energy efficiency side of things. But I think what's interesting to me is the kind of middle states, not necessarily the states that'll just do all natural gas, or the ones that'll just kind of continue doing what they're doing already, kind of ramping up subsidies. Those middle states that may not necessarily have been doing a lot already, and see what they come up with within their kind of interesting energy mix and situations. And I think it's those experiments that really could break open different approaches due to the regulations.
Yeah, states don't have too long to come up with their plan. The timeline EPA proposed that they would finalize this regulation by next June, and by the following year, 2016, states would have to submit their plans for compliance. So this is definitely going to be sparking serious conversation at the state level. As we mentioned, of course, it'll also be sparking plenty of legal battles over the next couple of years, and we'll see whether that timetable holds. But for example, I mean, you mentioned the diversity of these mixes. We have states like Georgia that are constructing new nuclear-fired power plants, which I think alone meet a substantial portion of that state's energy mix. So you might see nuclear being the main compliance tool in a state like Georgia. You might see renewables in a state like Iowa. This is going to be interesting. It's a very federalist approach to tackling this problem that gives a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility to states. Maybe that will increase the appeal of this relative to more top-down federal policy.
You know, there is another factor that's going to add complexity to this issue.
Yep.
And it's the fact that we do not have 50 isolated states. We have states that are all integrated with each other.
Right, and
that's going to create a real interesting situation as they develop these plans, because you know, today you've got certain states that actually generate a lot of, you know, they've got nuclear and they export power to the adjacent states.
Right.
And so I'm sure they're going to want some kind of compensation for that. And then that plan has to be integrated into that state that receives those imports.
Right, and interestingly, EPA is going to allow states to join into multi-state compacts to submit plans together. So we may start to see some regional plans emerging. As you mentioned, electricity, of course, flows freely across state boundaries. We have 3 interconnected power grids in the United States: one in the east, one in the west, and one in Texas, since it gets to do everything on its own. And of course, with the exception of Texas's system, power flows freely across those state boundaries and is traded quite frequently. So maybe we'll start to see more states talking to their neighbors about how to join into regional plans that maybe map onto some of the regional energy markets, the independent system operators or regional transmission operators that run multi-state power markets. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Of course, here in New England, where I am, we've enacted the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which involves several Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, and has already cut CO2 emissions here by about 40% since 2005. So some of the initial news reports here were that New England would sort of shrug off the 30% by 2030 target that EPA has thrown on the table. But of course, each state has to drive further based on what EPA thinks is possible, rather than on an even sort of across-the-board target for every state. So still more work to do here in New England as well. Matt, I want to talk to you briefly about what the international implications are of this. There was a lot of buzz just on Tuesday, the day after the EPA released their standards, that supposedly China was going to follow suit by adopting a national carbon cap sometime before 2030. This would be the first absolute limit on CO2 emissions in China. Of course, it looks like Reuters got a little bit ahead of themselves in reporting that story. It was a professor, an academic who is an advisor to the government that said that, not the government itself in any official capacity. But what does this mean for international talks? The long obstacle a longtime obstacle has been the reluctance of the United States or China to sort of go first. Who's going to be the one who takes the biggest steps in tackling this as the two largest emitters? Is this our first step forward, and is this change the game at the international level? What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I'm not entirely certain it's changed the game per se. I mean, you look at China; they've done something. They're doing something like this already. They're doing a province-driven kind of carbon and pollution standards way, and they've done that for a couple of years as like a pilot program, and they haven't had much success in getting the provinces to really follow through, or at least to stick to the regulations and standards to reduce pollution. So I'm not entirely sure that this model in particular is something that China can just pick up and run with. And I think maybe the EPA regulations impact on international climate negotiations are a little more hope-driven than certain. I think we may be conveniently ignoring, I think, the core economic reasons why a lot of these countries are just not inherently doing aggressive climate policy yet. And I don't know if the EPA regulations by themselves in a vacuum don't necessarily change that equation.
Right, and those concerns are primarily about what it costs to build out a lower carbon energy mix. How do you think this is likely to impact the development of technology that might in the long term impact that? Is this much of a pull for improvements and innovation in low carbon technology, or are we mostly just going to see a ramp up of gas-fired capacity and not much on the innovation front?
Yeah, and I think this right here, this is the big what if. If this is a really big pull on the clean tech innovation side, then it's well worth all the effort that's been put into it. The problem being is that when you look historically, and I'm talking about kind of the lion's share of the academic literature, and they analyze environmental policies' impact on technology innovation, they find it doesn't have much of an impact at all. For example, the Harvard Belfer Center did a study a couple years ago in the Clean Air Act and its impact on SO2 scrubbers, and found that those scrubbers actually existed technologically before the act was implemented, and it essentially pulled them into the market. It did what it was supposed to do, but much of the innovation side came from outside forces, government investment in innovation, some private sector incremental innovation, but the regulation itself, by itself, wasn't much of a driver of innovation. So I think just like where we were before EPA has done this, we're in the same place. We need a lot more comprehensive climate and clean energy policy that has innovation involved in it, because we can't just rely on the regulations to pull enough of these technologies and get the private sector innovating. And for that matter, I think the fact that it's a modest goal over the next 15 years proves out that maybe EPA understands this. We can't go too far too fast. Otherwise, the technology may not necessarily catch up to where the regulations expect it to be. So I think at the end of the day, if we even want more stringent regulations, say past 2030, we really need to get the innovation policy solid up, because we may not be able to ramp up to 50 or 60 or 70% carbon cuts in the power sector without it.
Yeah, if we look at how EPA calculated the targets for each state, it's clear that they're looking at pushing the needle a little bit on what existing technologies can do, but it's largely looking at what trajectory we're already on and saying let's just set the bar out a little bit higher. So clearly, efforts to improve the ability of low carbon technologies to scale up would pave the way for more aggressive policy and regulations in the future. My hope, at least, just to wrap this up a little bit, is that whereas EPA, of course, can't do much on the innovation policy front, that's not their prerogative, that at least this sets the agenda for each state, and some states may choose to be a little bit more proactive in how they choose to comply, look beyond just that 2030 target at how they want to have their energy mix develop in the long term and what technology policies they can implement to get things on the right track. Jeff, I want to go ahead, John.
That's a very key point, Jesse, is that a consistency of a long-term plan is going to be necessary not only for innovation but for cost effectiveness.
Right.
Because one of the things when you read through the EPA literature on this regulation that stands out is that there seems to be a little bit of political rhetoric there. Because they basically emphasize that businesses will continue to maintain a competitive edge. And building on what Matt says, is if developed countries like China and India really do embrace lower carbon technologies, that will basically aid developed countries in achieving those competitive edges. But if it turns out that the developing countries basically, repeat the history of all the developed countries in the world, their carbon emissions are going to skyrocket, and while developed countries will drop, and that's going to end up with a whole gamut of issues, particularly around carbon leakage, which is part of the problem statement today. And when manufacturing gets exported and you import the finished goods, guess what you've done? You've lost the economic advantage, plus the carbon advantage is gone too, because you're going possibly to a country that has higher carbon intensity. And
right.
So that's why it's going to be very important that the EPA moving forward, they monitor very carefully the performance and the costs. Because when you look through some of these fact sheets the EPA put out, they've highlighted the market-based 10, the 10 states that have market-based carbon trading systems. But there's one statistic that sticks out like a sore thumb, which is not mentioned in the EPA literature, is the fact that those 10 have power costs that are 35% greater than the average in the country. Okay, and that's just reinforcing the fact that this cleaner power is not cheaper currently. Now that doesn't mean that with innovation we won't make those improvements, but in the short term that's a risk that we need to monitor to make sure that we're not overly aggressive on moving forward, and also don't create uncertainty so that people are afraid to make that investment. Because take for example the MATS regulation, where control metals from coal-fired power plants, is that you have enough people that designed, because they had more efficient coal plant, and they designed to put the stack scrubbers. Now they're facing shutdown. So what happened? They potentially lost that money that they invested to make a cleaner coal power plant, based on the metals emissions only.
Right.
So that's really just a comment. We really got to watch the progress and the practicality, but one of the practicality parts is the cost.
Yep. And of course, you need regulatory certainty to guide investments going forward. One of the challenges on that front, even as EPA sorts out these regulations, they're of course going to face legal challenges. I think it's all but certain there'll be a variety of legal challenges to this policy. Jeff, you listened to the broadcast earlier this morning from Resources for the Future. As you mentioned, they got in to some of those legal challenges that are likely to emerge. Do you want to run us through some of the big ones that we should have our eye on going forward? Where is EPA likely to face the biggest challenge, and how are they likely to defend the statutory and legal authority of this new regulation?
Sure. Some of the things that I heard this morning that I thought gave some pause for thought here. Among the risks that EPA has taken on in proposing this regulation this way, they're going beyond the fence. People talk about in the fence, outside the fence. Typically, all of the Clean Air Act-driven regulation has focused on inside the fence, what's happening at the generating unit itself, and regulating that to some standard, whether it's sulfur or nitrogen pollution, some other factor, the metals. Now what they're doing is they're saying basically in order to meet these targets, you also need to include measures outside the fence. Renewable energy, energy efficiency, things like that. These are things that are beyond the purview of many of the generators, certainly the merchant generators. So even though you might have a utility that has a wide array of technology in their generating mix, you may have others that only have one or two technologies, and that are simply not set up to add renewable energy to that. And you're basically requiring them to make those kind of investments. That's one risk. Another key risk is this whole issue of making states the responsible parties rather than the utilities. Again, past regulations have focused on the utilities.
Although, on that front, I mean, this regulation was issued under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act, which is set up to basically set targets for states to comply with. So there is some precedent for devolving responsibility to the states. Usually this is done to set what they call sort of non-attainment zones for criteria pollutants, where there's an area of the country where we have high levels of pollution, like smog or sulfur, and they'll set a limit that the states then have to find a way to help meet. So it seems like they're following on that kind of track rather than on the emissions performance standards that have applied to individual.
That exact point, Jesse, was debated this morning, and what that was that as the statute is written, the statute basically talks about EPA regulating standards for new sources and states regulating standards for existing sources.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a disconnect there. How, in fact, EPA here is saying, here are the standards that we require you to use. Is that allowing the states to set their own standards or not? Another one of the key points that came out, the EPA talks a lot in this thing about what they call the best system of emissions reductions, BSER, as their key building blocks. But it's a best system of emissions reduction relative to what? Applied where? Is it applied at the plant? Is it applied someplace else? Then there's a broader issue that, in effect, in terms of redispatching, which is basically shifting from existing coal-fired power plants to existing gas-fired power plants, in effect, the EPA is creating a discriminatory business environment where it basically says, for no other reason than this regulation, and based on nothing that you've done or not done, your plant doesn't get to run as much, and this guy's plant does get to run more. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Those were some of the legal issues that were brought out. The other issue that I want to touch on, I think, here is the politics. I think we can't lose sight of the fact that, because there was not comprehensive climate legislation, and that ultimately proved to be impossible for more reasons than we could cover even in another call like this. The administration has chosen to do this through its executive powers, through an agency like the EPA. But what that means is that the next administration could essentially look at this and say, you know what, we don't think that was strong enough, we're going to double down. They could look at it and say, this went way too far, we're going to ratchet back. Or they could look at it and say, this is completely the wrong direction, and we are going to abandon this before it's even implemented. So this creates enormous uncertainties for anybody that's looking to have to make the substantial investments that we're talking about here, other than switching from existing power plants that run one fuel to another fuel, where the steel is already on the ground. Everything else that we're talking about here requires substantial investment. Who's going to make those investments given the kinds of, not just legal uncertainties, but political uncertainties that are going to revolve around this regulation?
Yeah, it's a tough environment for investors in power plants, of course. Hopefully this is at least some amount of, some step towards resolving this uncertainty. But I was talking, working on regulations for electric utilities in the Pacific Northwest in 2006 and 2008, and this was on the docket then. How do they plan their long-term investments in light of the risk of future carbon regulation? That was a hot topic almost a decade ago, and of course Congress took a swing at that and was unable to resolve the issue. So here we are several years later with EPA regulations likely to spark several more years of continued uncertainty. Hopefully we're moving in the right direction, at least in terms of resolving this issue in a way that lets the power sector move forward. Matt, you're there in Washington, you're our man on the ground. What do you see as sort of some of the political reactions to this, to the announcement this week? Obviously I think I've heard the quotes from John Boehner that Obama's plan is, quote, nuts. So perhaps a predictable response from a Republican Party that so far has been really unable or unwilling to come up with any sort of proactive plan on carbon dioxide and climate change. Is this just more business as usual partisan politics that we're going to see, and really whoever wins in the 2014 midterms and 2016 midterms gets to determine the course of this over the long term?
Yeah, I think the reaction's been completely predictable. The typical, the Republicans are completely against it. This is a job killer, a doomsday for the economy. Most Democrats are generally for it. Like you said, the midterm elections coming up are adding an interesting twist. So a lot of moderate Democrats in coal states, places like West Virginia and Alaska, having tough re-election battles, they're going to come out strongly against it. But when you think about it politically, the only way I think that Congress could have any impact here is if the Senate completely goes to a veto-proof majority, that they can override the president's veto before he leaves office. And I don't think anybody expects that to occur, so you have to expect these regulations are going to move forward as is, at least for the next few years, regardless of what happens in the midterms or regardless of what Congress responds to today.
Right. So even if the Republicans take control of the Senate with a majority, they're unlikely to have 60 votes to sustain a filibuster, or even 67 to overturn a veto, which President Obama would likely use to defend the policy.
Right.
So then, given the timeline they're talking about, we're talking about maybe the 2016 presidential election as being the key determinant of whether or not this is cemented or not, much like the 2012 election was key to determining whether or not the Affordable Care Act would become law, become a sustained policy or not. So, going to be interesting to see how this plays out over the next couple of years in the political cycle. Be interesting to see also if there's some kind of an alternative response from the GOP as to what do we do about carbon. If it's not this, then what? The response so far has been nothing. Don't do anything about it. It's not a problem. We exhale carbon, and that's just fine. And I think obviously that leaves a lot to be desired. So I'm interested to see what might emerge as an alternative route if regulations, which many economists argue are not the most efficient way to do this, is the default. What's the alternative path that might generate broader support? And if you could pull off a bipartisan proposal, then you might have an alternative there that could sustain political support. I was curious. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Matt, I got a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
In reading over the EPA literature on the justification for the bill as it's written, the one thing that just kind of caught my attention is that they're advertising this $93 billion savings, and when you dig into the detail, as it turns out, 2/3 of that is based on respiratory health issues, which are tied to particulate matter, NOx, and SOx, and metals, and they have nothing to do with carbon. And it's kind of curious that the majority of the claimed benefit would be based on current regulations, and why didn't they separate the carbon from the existing regulations if that was an important issue?
I don't know their inherent reason why they didn't separate the two. I mean, you're hitting at a key problem when doing any of these type of cost-benefit analysis, is that we're talking, at least on the climate side, the social benefit of carbon reductions, and there's an extreme debate on what that social benefit actually is, whether it's small or big, and that really, so at the end of the day, what this really comes down to is if you view climate change as an inherent threat to society, and there's going to be an economic cost, a social cost attached to that, or whatever that number is, then we need to lower emissions.
But I understand, but if the regulations on climate change, wouldn't you expect the majority of the documented benefits to be related to carbon?
Like I said, that comes down to the debate over what that actual social cost of carbon is, and I don't think that's not a settled debate on what that number is per se. I know the administration has their number that they use, but that's very much debated within the academic literature, within the climate community, and elsewhere. So I think it's tough to put what the total benefit of reducing carbon is attached to something like this.
Yeah, it's also a challenge with cost-benefit analysis because those CBA, cost-benefit analyses apply some kind of discount rate that reduces the value of future benefits relative to benefits today, and those discount rates tend to be fairly high for these analyses. So if most of the benefits of reducing CO2 emissions accrue in the future as we avoid what would otherwise have been more damaging climate change, then those don't look like as substantial a benefit today because they're discounted heavily relative to the benefits of reduced asthma, heart disease, lung disease that are caused by reducing our use of coal and coal-related emissions today, which aren't discounted quite so heavily. So it's a tricky one. I mean, these cost-benefit analyses have some utility, and they also have some inherent flaws and challenges to.
But you get my point. Is if the respiratory issues tied to what we normally call conventional pollutants are that important, they need to move forward on those, and not let them get tied up with carbon in the political arena.
Well, we of course regulate those other emissions through other policies as well. I think that what they're trying to do is look at what are the additional co-benefits of a movement towards a lower carbon power mix, and that tends to also bring along these additional public health benefits that are in addition to those delivered by current regulations on sulfur or heavy metals or acid gases or the other things you mentioned.
And you also got to figure that.
Not surprising though, guys, is that all these respiratory related pollutants, they're all tied to coal plants.
Right.
As one would expect.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Are there any other issues you want to surface here before we wrap up? I mean, there's lots to talk about, of course, and we'll keep monitoring this as it develops. I think one of the interesting things will be to see how each state starts to respond to this. But maybe we'll go through, and each of you can kind of give your closing take on this. I mean, how do you take this? Is this a historic step forward? Is this just more muddled confusion from our political system? You know, how do we make what do we make of this? What are our key takeaways from it? Jeff, let's start with you.
I think that it's sort of the sell the news by the facts approach to this. There's a big fuss right now. It looks like this huge milestone. I think the jury will be out on that until we see the 50-state plan. The other aspect of that is that, although there's all sorts of flexibility included here, some of this still ends up being somewhat prescriptive because the EPA dug pretty deep into what it sees happening in each of these states and devising the performance standards that it has published. So it's not clear that the states have quite as much leeway in meeting those standards given what actually exists on the ground and the technological choices that are available in the time frame, as one might think. And I think the reality here is that we can argue all day about whether or not something could have been done on a national level, but doing this in 50 chunks is almost certainly going to be more expensive than doing this in one more consistent approach. And I think that that's going to be one of the things that we'll have to watch. If this really does raise costs significantly, then it really counters some of the gains that we've made in the last few years as a result of the shale gas revolution. I am a little more optimistic than John about the ability of shale to at least meet the initial needs. EPA is looking at essentially only an extra 1 trillion cubic feet a year. I ran numbers that suggested that ramping up all of the existing natural gas combined cycle plants to 75% would essentially require an extra 4 trillion cubic feet a year. We've added that much since 2008. I think what gets interesting is that a lot of people have a lot of plans for gas over the next few years. People want to export it, turn it into LNG. People want to use it as the basis for new industries. People want to use more of it in power generation. People want to run vehicles on it. All of this is going to be competing in the marketplace at the same time that the EPA is looking to make a substantial shift, the most available piece of which right now is natural gas. Again, you've got this unutilized capacity that turns out to be larger than the entire existing renewable energy capacity in the country. Renewables generated about 500 billion kilowatt hours last year. Natural gas could add 600 billion kilowatt hours just with the shift in the combined cycle plant. So I think the battle over gas could get very interesting.
We're going to have to keep an eye on that. That's definitely right, and we'll see what the price of gas does as those all those demands ramp up. John, what do you think? What are your key takeaways from this week's news?
Well, I think the real key here is that a large part of the carbon reduction is going to come out of the highest carbon intensity, which is going to be coal. And then it comes down to how do we best replace that? Efficiency, that's a no-brainer. That should always move forward, regardless of what's going on. As far as the gas goes, like I said, my 1 trillion feet imports, that really has a total increase of 6 trillion feet, by 2030 based on the EIA original projection, which is a little higher than what a lot of people are using now. But one thing I think that's been kind of overlooked that needs further discussion is one of the best, lowest carbon sources that we have and most flexible that will help ensure reliability. And that's my concern moving forward is we push the reserves down to levels to where the power grid reliabilities do tangibly suffer, particularly with changing weather conditions. But nuclear, for some reason, has been left out of this discussion. And from my perspective, particularly as the costs run up, nuclear is going to be a very key part of replacing the base load capacity from fossil fuels.
Yeah, do you think this is going to give a boost to nuclear's prospects? I know several plants announced retirement recently. This may give some more economic headwinds as they look into the future and whether it's worth repowering for another 20 or 30 years.
I think definitely, we're going to have to maintain the capacity we have, but also we're going to have to be much more aggressive and serious about expanding that capacity. And, of course, we can use the more modern technologies or the thorium-based fuel systems, which are generally safer. But still, nuclear is the ideal baseload capacity out there. And you can modify it to run intermediate or peaking power through lots of different technology. But at the end of the day, it's reliable and it has zero carbon.
Matt, what do you think? What's your key takeaway here from Washington?
I certainly think it's a landmark regulation. I think it's important. I think ultimately at the end of the day it's going to be a unique experiment. I mean, look at it this way. The United States has been doing a bottom-up approach to climate policy for the last 10 years. The states have really taken the lead on a lot of this. So what the EPA is doing is saying, all right, ramp all this up, get more aggressive, do some more experimentation. And I think that's the right way to do it. And we're going to get some really interesting policies and technology options out of it. With that said, I think it's clear just from the narrative from a lot of the climate community and folks from industry that this can't be it, that we need a lot more climate and energy policy from the federal level, particularly on the innovation side, and we can't discount that need. So we can't just kind of raise the flag and say we've won and we'll check back in 10 years and see how we're doing. With the game's not over yet, but I think it's a really good moment in time, particularly with a lot of the political gridlock. The fact that we can even say the U.S. is going to lower carbon emissions as mandated by a policy within kind of this really gridlock debate we're having, I think is astounding just by itself.
So maybe not the best option to move forward, but the only one perhaps on the table. EPA carbon regulations released on Monday for power plants across the country, now able to put carbon on the agenda for all 50 states. And prompt states to release their own plans as to how they're going to comply with EPA regulation. Big news on the energy front. I appreciate all of you joining me, Matt Stepp in Washington, Jeff Stiles, and John Miller. Unfortunately, Jim Pierobon's internet connection cut out on us, so we weren't able to have him join us. But each of you, we're going to keep an eye on each of your columns at theenergycollective.com for your thoughts on this news, and really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. We'll keep the conversation going on Twitter and, of course, at theenergycollective.com. Thanks.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you.
Thank you.